Hollywood loves a good sequel, or maybe it's a spin-off. Regardless of what it is, it's a second strike, and I've got all the information right now. Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell, here to talk about the big news that is enveloping Hollywood, and it's really all Hollywood will be talking about until a settlement is reached, which is of course the actor strike, which began at midnight today. They are joining now the Writers Guild of America on the picket lines. So we're going to be talking about why the actors are on strike, what the effects are going to be, and what the road toward a settlement might look like. But let's start first of all with a little bit of background about the people involved here. The actors in Hollywood are on strike, but they're part of a union called SAG-AFTRA. SAG-AFTRA is the merger of two different unions, SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, and AFTRA, which stands for the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. They merged back in 2012, and they cover similar areas. The Screen Actors Guild was usually covering film and television actors. AFTRA covered a lot of broadcast, TV, radio. So now they're kind of under one umbrella, and they're operating under different contracts. That's another thing. Not every member of SAG-AFTRA is on strike. It's only the members that operate under the contracts covered by the AMPTP, or the American Motion Picture and Television Producers. I know it's a lot of different acronyms, but I'll be calling them probably the producers mostly. And it's the same group that the Writers Guild of America also was not able to come to terms with, and the reason why they are on strike and have been for over 2 months now. And as I'm sure you've read, any actor who is in a movie or a broadcast narrative show or a streaming show is now on strike. But which members of SAG-AFTRA are allowed to work right now? Well, if you're a member of SAG-AFTRA and you work in the field of video games, audiobooks, the music industry, commercials, you're allowed to work, as are journalists and TV anchors who belong to SAG-AFTRA, as long as that work doesn't involve any type of work that would be covered under a regular narrative television or movie contract. For example, if you're a TV anchor right now, a news anchor in Los Angeles, then you can be a news anchor on Los Angeles TV. But if a studio says that they want you to come and play yourself in a movie, then as a SAG-AFTRA member, you are not allowed to do that, because that is the part of the contract that is under strike right now. And it's this contract that has been the sticking point, which covers movies, narrative shows on broadcast and streaming, and negotiations have been going on for quite some time. They actually began back on June 7th, which was just a few days after the Directors Guild of America was able to strike a deal with the AMPTP, and this was something that concerned a lot of people in Hollywood. If you'll remember a couple months ago when I was talking about the writer's strike, at that time there was the prospect perhaps of a three-headed strike, that the writers would go on strike first, followed by the directors, and then the actors. Well, the writers did go on strike, but the directors were able to secure a deal. And if the actors had not gone on strike, then the writers would have found themselves alone on the picket lines and probably in a much less advantageous bargaining position, because the producers have not been to the table at all with the writers since the strike began. A lot of people have been messaging me saying, why haven't you given any updates on the writer's strike? It's because there's no updates to give. It is glacial. It is frozen in ice. There has been no progress. The writers are just on the picket lines with no end in sight, which is something that we'll discuss in a few minutes. The directors were able to get a deal with the producers that they were happy with, but that didn't necessarily mean that the actors would be able to do the same thing. And after a promising start to contract talks, they began to break down. However, there was an extension to those contract talks. It was originally supposed to expire on June 30th. There was a 12-day extension to July 12th. SAG-AFTRA has been very open about the fact that they felt that this was a legitimate extension to the negotiating time, and they say that they went back to the table, but that the producers didn't show up, and they now feel duped. They feel that the producers asked for that 12-day extension in order to have another 12 days to promote their summer movies before all of the actors went on strike. And if you've seen how many Barbie premieres there were in the last 12 days, I think that that theory might hold a little bit of credence. So the AMPTP, the producers, we know them from the Writers Guild strike. They are an alliance of the heads of the major studios and streamers as well. So the head of Warner, the head of Disney, the head of Netflix, and they basically negotiate as a group in order to come to terms with actors, directors, and writers separately. And these deals are usually negotiated every 3 years. Most years the negotiation goes fine. Some years there's the threat of a strike, and then every once in a while, one or two of these groups will go on strike. However, they usually go on strike in different years. It's very uncommon for more than one of the actors, directors, or writers to go on strike, and the directors particularly have almost never gone on strike. The current president of SAG-AFTRA is Fran Drescher. Yes, that Fran Drescher, known to people of my generation as the nanny. She, along with the executive director and head of the negotiating committee, Duncan Crabtree Ireland, have largely been the public face and voice of SAG-AFTRA throughout this process.
You cannot change the business model as much as it has changed and not expect the contract to change too.
So what exactly was it that SAG-AFTRA was asking for from the producers? Well, let's break it down a little bit. Like the writers, the actors were also asking for an overall increase in pay across the board, as well as increased residuals from streaming shows. The request for increased residuals for streaming is because there are fewer episodes on streaming and because the actors wanted to be able to financially participate in the success of a show on streaming, which is not really how the system's set up. There's not really a performance-based residual system in place at all. And again, this is something that the writers have wanted to address with the producers as well. And as far as the overall increase in pay, again, that's linked to the fact that shows now have fewer episodes per season and fewer seasons overall, which means that it is tougher for actors to make a living on a television show, and also just as an adjustment overall because of inflation. AI is also a huge sticking point for the actors, as it has been for the writers. The writers don't want AI to be used to write scripts, and the actors want very restrictive guidelines placed on their likenesses and when AI can be used to use their images and how they can be compensated for those images, or if they can grant approval for the use of their image. One thing that is specific to actors with this contract negotiation is the use of something called self-tapes. And it all goes back to COVID, when the casting offices were closed, when you couldn't put a bunch of people in a room together for an open casting call. Then actors started recording themselves reading the script pages that were sent over to them. They would record it and send it to the casting directors, and that was called a self-tape. Basically, you record yourself, and it was something that was out of necessity because you couldn't go to a casting office. There was nothing that was happening in person. The issue that actors have now, though, is that now that COVID restrictions have lifted, many studios are still using self-tapes because it is easier than the traditional audition process and cheaper as well. You don't have the overhead. You don't have a casting office. You just send the pages to an actor and tell them to record themselves and then send it to the casting director. Well, the actors are saying that this is actually disadvantageous to actors for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're doing a lot of the work that casting directors would do. Also, they don't get the opportunity to interact with casting directors and perhaps even other actors, which they say is an advantage to their career. And also, they say that this puts up a technological barrier and perhaps even an economic barrier for actors who don't know how to do this technology or can't afford technology to send in a good self-tape. So they're looking for a way to go back to the more traditional form of auditioning. There were some other issues on the table, and there were some things that SAG-AFTRA has said that they caved on. For example, they initially were seeking to have actors compensated for when a movie is re-released. They say that they dropped that issue in the spirit of negotiation, but that was not reciprocated. So what exactly was so far apart about the actors and the producers and their stances on these issues? When it comes to the overall increase in minimum payment, SAG-AFTRA says that the producers tried to use the deal that they gave the directors against actors, basically saying, well, we gave the directors this percentage increase in their minimum payments, and so that's all that we're going to give you. And the actors said, well, that's great for the directors, but we're not the directors. And this was one reason why a lot of people in Hollywood were upset that directors took a deal with producers, because they were afraid that this very thing was going to happen, that the director's deal would be used as a template for the other unions and would undercut their negotiating power. Now, I'm not necessarily saying the director shouldn't have made a deal with producers. It went to the entire guild. They voted to not strike because they were happy with the terms, or the majority of directors were. But it is kind of unquestionable that them making a deal did weaken the bargaining power of the other unions who are now on strike against producers. On the issue of streaming residuals, the AMPTP claimed that they offered some concessions when it comes to higher residuals for performances in international markets, not domestic, as well as higher residual payments for guest stars. But that's not exactly what SAG-AFTRA is looking for. The actors were looking for the establishment of a completely new system in order to calculate streaming residuals. Now, in a press conference that they held yesterday, SAG-AFTRA claims that they knew that the streamers would balk at the idea of releasing their streaming numbers. That's what everybody said. Streamers will never release those numbers. So the actors claimed that they came up with a compromise solution, which was to use a third-party measurement system when it comes to the performance of streaming shows, so the streamers wouldn't have to release their own analytics. They could look at the reports from this third party who's able to measure viewership and say like, okay, well, if we accept that this is how the movies are doing or the shows are doing, then this is what we'll base our residuals on. But apparently the streamer said, well, no, you can't do that because those numbers aren't reliable because they're third-party numbers.
This was their distraction tactic to try to avoid engaging on a totally legitimate proposal. And from day 1 to day 35 of these negotiations, we never got any substantive response to that proposal.
So basically, it seems like the streamers are saying, we won't give you our numbers, but we also won't let you use someone else's numbers because they're not reliable. Our numbers are more reliable, which you can't have. Regarding AI, the producers at the AMPTP claimed in a press release that the actors walked away from what they considered to be a groundbreaking proposal about compensating actors for the use of their likeness. But at their press conference yesterday, the actors claimed that this groundbreaking proposal constituted an offer to scan the likeness of a background extra, the people that you see walking around or sitting in the background of a movie or a TV show, that basically they would scan their likeness, pay them a day rate, but then the studios would own the use of that likeness in perpetuity to use however they want. So you would basically own the scan of a person to put in any kind of movie or use it for any purpose, which they said may have been a groundbreaking offer, but certainly was not the offer that they were planning to take.
So if you think that's a groundbreaking proposal, I suggest you think again.
Finally, on the third major issue, which is the self-tape auditions, producers claimed that they offered to cut down on the use of self-tape auditions and instead that they would allow actors to do virtual auditions or in-person auditions. But SAG-AFTRA claims that this was just that, an offer, that there was no enforcement or any kind of guarantee, that it was basically the studio saying, hey, we're going to do better, but without anything other than trusting their word. There was no real system in place. While SAG-AFTRA has said that there was some early agreement on smaller issues or room to compromise with the producers, it's also very obvious that they are far apart on the major issues. And even after federal mediators were brought in for the last day of negotiating, there could not be an agreement reached. So yesterday, the National Board of SAG-AFTRA voted for a strike to happen, and that strike officially began, as I said, at midnight, which means as of right now, no member of SAG-AFTRA is allowed to participate in any kind of activity that is covered under the contract, which has now expired, with the producers at the AMPTP. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that actors hit the picket line starting today alongside the writers. So if you live in Los Angeles or if you live in any area that has a major studio, you're going to see a big uptick in the number of people that are picketing outside of those studios. And as for the actors themselves, obviously no on-camera work is allowed in any capacity for a movie, broadcast, or streaming narrative program. That also means that any movie or show using SAG-AFTRA actors that was currently shooting, movies like Deadpool 3 or Gladiator 2, is essentially, as of this moment, shut down. I asked for your questions about the strike over on the social network Threads, where I have an account and I'm kind of ramping up my activity there as I get the landscape, the lay of the land. And by far the most asked question was, when will we as moviegoers start to see the effects of this strike? Or when will my favorite show on television or streaming start to be delayed? And that's a great question. The answer really is that it's a bit of a snowball effect. The longer this strike goes on, the bigger the impact will be. If they can settle the strike next week, then the delays will be minimal. But if this goes on for 2 or 3 or 4 months, then we will start seeing major delays on projects like, for example, Beyond the Spider-Verse. It's been pretty much assumed that Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse was not going to make its release date next spring, but because it reportedly had not finished recording voices or perhaps not even started recording voices, and now those voices cannot be recorded until after the strike, then it is very likely that that movie is going to to be delayed. Any movie that's shooting right now, like I said, Deadpool 3, if this goes on for 2 or 3 months, those movies will likely be delayed. And then we have movies that are still in active development because casting now cannot happen while the strike is going on. In many ways, in a kind of way, this is kind of a repeat of the pandemic. At the very beginning, people thought, oh, theaters might be closed for a few weeks, so we'll take our May release and we'll push it to July. And then as things kept going, they're like, you know what, we're going to take it out of this year entirely. We could see something very similar to this depending on the length of the strike. Now, there are a few high-profile exceptions to all actors not working for shows like House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon is a show that is produced entirely in the UK, and actors in the UK work with a different union. It's called British Actors Equity, or Equity. UK labor laws actually prohibit unions over there from striking in solidarity with other unions. So even if Equity wanted to say, hey, we stand with our actors in America and we're going to go on strike, legally they could not in the UK. And there are members of SAG-AFTRA that are working on projects under Equity contracts. They can also keep working because those shows are not under the SAG-AFTRA contract, they are under an Equity contract. SAG-AFTRA has also said that there is a pathway through the union to get approval for truly independent projects to advance. So this would be a movie, for example, that has no connection to any studio that has a contract with SAG-AFTRA. They could potentially be able to get a waiver to go, but these would be the smallest of movies. Non-narrative programs like reality shows and game shows aren't covered by the contract, so those are still fair game, as are talk shows, except that talk shows aren't on the air right now because of the writer's strike. And even if they were on the air, and an actor was to go on a talk show, they couldn't talk about any movie that they're currently in or have been in or that they could be promoting. So Margot Robbie, for example, couldn't go on, let's say, Stephen Colbert if he came back on tomorrow and talk about Barbie. And that's because promotion of upcoming projects is another thing that's expressly forbidden under strike rules. That means no walking the red carpet at a premiere, no for your consideration campaigning for the recent Emmy nominees, no appearances at film festivals or award shows, no press junkets to talk about upcoming movies, and no convention appearances, which means that San Diego Comic-Con, which already doesn't have a lot of its marquee talent as far as Disney or Marvel or anybody else going there to do big Hall H panels. Unless the strike is settled in the next couple weeks, there will also be no celebrities there if they're a member of SAG-AFTRA to promote anything that they are working on. So Comic-Con may actually have to be about comics this year. Actors are even prohibited from promoting their projects on social media. And we've already seen the fallout from this. Yesterday at the Oppenheimer premiere, the stars of the movie literally left the premiere once the strike was officially called in solidarity with the union so that they would not be seen promoting what is essentially now a struck project. In addition, actors are not allowed to audition during a strike, nor are their agents allowed to negotiate on their behalf for a part during the strike, which means that all casting essentially comes to a halt, and this is where it affects a project like Superman Legacy. James Gunn already could not write or revise his script during the writer's strike, but we've seen all of this news about casting come out because he was still allowed to cast the movie. Well, that stops as of today because no actor can audition and no agent can negotiate and no actor can accept a part in any kind of a movie or TV show, which again is going to hurt the development of movies like Superman Legacy because they're basically stuck in limbo to fill all of these roles until the end of the actor strike. If the writer's strike was like a hand grenade, in that the effects when it comes to the entertainment industry were times to go off a little bit down the road, then this actor strike is like Wile E. Coyote pushing the plunger down on TNT. It just blows everything up immediately. Now, it would be theoretically in everybody's interest to reach an amicable deal as soon as possible, but that doesn't necessarily look like it's going to be in the cards. The funny thing is, this actually isn't the first time that the actors and the writers have gone on strike together. Back in 1960, the actors and writers went on strike at the same time, and that got both guilds compensation for movies that were replayed on, at that time, the new technology, which would be television. It also got extra added pension money for the writers and the establishment of the pension plan for the Actors Guild. At that time, at least in part in 1960, the president of the Actors Guild was Ronald Reagan. And this was an example of two guilds going on strike, having similar interests, and both of them being able to settle their dispute with producers to their mutual satisfaction through their combined power. The last time the Actors Guild went on strike against the film and TV producers was back in 1980, and it was also about a new technology. It was about royalties from video cassette rentals and purchases, as well as royalties for movies that were bought for cable and pay television, and they were able to get what they wanted. Of course, not everything that they wanted or as much as they wanted, but they were able to get the royalties. They were also able to get additional compensation for their pension funds and benefits and all of that. So this is the example of your typical strike. It's new ground. The actors got a version of what they wanted. There was some compromise, but eventually, after a few months, everybody went back to work. The 1960 and 1980 strikes were actually very similar to this one in that they both revolved around emerging ways to watch film and television, and that's really what we have here with streaming. But the thing that's really changed since those two previous strikes is the AMPTP and who makes up the AMPTP, because it's no longer just a collection of studio and network heads. These are now CEOs of multinational corporations with arms that reach into so many different divisions that go beyond film and television and go beyond even the United States. There's a palpable anger that you can feel toward the producers at the AMPTP, first from the writers and then this week from the actors.
I am shocked by the way the people that we have been in business with are treating us. I cannot believe it, quite frankly, how far apart we are on so many things.
And I think it's because of the tone and tenor of these negotiations. And it really all boiled over this past week when an article ran in Deadline quoting an anonymous studio exec aligned with the AMPTP who said, quote, "The end game is to allow things to drag on until union members start losing their apartments and losing their houses." Another source was quoted as saying, quote, that this was a cruel but necessary evil. While the AMPTP has tried to distance itself from these remarks, their actions seem to back up what was said in this article because, as I noted earlier, there have been no negotiations with the writers since that strike began 70 plus days ago. So if the producers are eager to make a deal, well, their actions certainly don't show that. Adding to this anger is the fact that the AMPTP is saying that the reason they won't give in to these concessions is because it's too expensive and that this would financially burden the studios, while at the same time paying their executives tens of millions of dollars per year. And again, in a case of spectacular timing, Bob Iger, on the morning the strike began, angered many in Hollywood with these comments that were made to CNBC.
Well, I think it's very disturbing to me. We've talked about disruptive forces on this business and all the challenges that we're facing and the recovery from COVID, which is ongoing. It's not completely back. This is the worst time in the world to add to that disruption. There's a level of expectation that they have that is just not realistic. And they are adding to a set of challenges that this business is already facing.
So up until this point, I've tried to be somewhat objective with my reporting of the facts on the strike. But this is where my editorializing begins because I can't really report impassively on this part of the story. Again and again, and in Bob Iger's comments there, the CEOs and producers at the AMPTP have said that the writers and actors are being very inconsiderate by striking right now because the business is in a huge state of flux and they are choosing to strike at a very disruptive time for the entertainment industry. And every time I hear one of them say that, the same question kind of bounces around inside of my head, which is, well, whose fault is that? The producers couldn't have stopped COVID. That was going to happen no matter what. But all of the other things that have disrupted the industry came straight from the top. For example, the producers and CEOs, they were the ones who dumped tens of billions of dollars into a streaming strategy that now, even though most outside observers said this was going to be the case, apparently is not going to be the revenue generator that they thought it was going to be. So these tens of billions of dollars of debt that all of these companies are in, it's largely because from the top, they decided to incur these massive debts in trying to catch up to Netflix or replace Netflix. That wasn't the actors and the writers, that was the CEOs. When they talk about this being a very disruptive action, they are the ones who made the decision to disrupt the industry, to tell people to watch things at home, to put movies on streaming services mere weeks after they were released in theaters, or at the same time that they were released in theaters, or to skip theaters altogether and just put them straight on that streaming service because they wanted to cash in on this strategy. And that is absolutely costing them money at the box office. I can't tell you how many comments I see for movies that say, oh, I didn't go see it because I'm going to wait for streaming. I didn't go see this movie because I know it's going to be on streaming. That's another reason why they're in so much debt, is because they cost themselves that box office capital because they trained the audience not to go to theaters. That wasn't the actors, that wasn't the writers, that was the executives. The executives are the ones who greenlit an insane acceleration as far as how many movies and shows were made, especially for their landmark franchises, the ones that make them so much money. They didn't really seem to understand the basic tenets of supply and demand or the value of scarcity in the marketplace as they threw a show after show, movie after movie, watering down their product over and over again. That wasn't the writers. That wasn't the actors. As a matter of fact, the writers and the actors are the ones that they turned to and said, you got to deliver this stuff for us right now. We've got to compete. And now, as the industry is in free fall, and actors and writers are going to these producers saying, you have completely cut the bottom out of the film and television industry, and we now have to fight you in order to just maintain a living here. They're saying, well, our profits are too low. What do you want us to do about it? You're being greedy. You're being way too greedy. And yet at the same time, every single one of these actors and writers knows that all of these executives care about is the bottom line, and they will replace them with computers at the first opportunity. This isn't a case of the executives smiling to your face and holding a knife behind their back. These executives are holding two knives to the throats of the actors and the writers, and they're saying, why won't you make a deal with us? I'm not saying that all the demands that the writers and actors have are reasonable. We've gone through all of them here on this show a few different times. And I've even said that there's a few that I don't think that they should happen or that doesn't quite seem right to me. But you have to negotiate. That's the point of negotiation. That's how it works. Again, executives you would think would understand that. But instead, you have the producers that are pointing at the writers and actors and saying, you're putting these thousands of people out in business. You're causing all of this pain in Hollywood. And yet they're the ones, it seems, who refuse to come to the table. They say that the demands are unreasonable from the writers and actors, and yet they won't negotiate those demands. They just let the strike drag on and then blame everybody else for the damage that's being caused without taking any of it onto themselves. It's almost as if there's an issue right now around the world with corporate accountability. I don't know if anybody's ever told the producers this, but somebody should. You will never be the good guy. You will never be seen as the underdog or the victim in this situation or any situation, because there are a hell of a lot of starving writers and starving actors out there, and I don't see a whole lot of starving executives. That interview that Bob Iger did when he was talking about the disturbing actor strike that was unfolding, that interview happened at something called the Sun Valley Conference. It's an annual event thrown by a private investment firm called Allen & Company, and it's often referred to as Billionaire Summers Camp. This week, this very week, the week that the second major entertainment Hollywood union was at the negotiating table and called a strike against all of their companies, these were some of the people that were at this conference. Not only Disney CEO Bob Iger, but also Sherry Redstone, the head of Paramount Global. David Zaslav, of course, was there. Comcast president Michael Cavanaugh, Apple CEO Tim Cook, all of them were there, all flown in on their private jets to hobnob with other billionaires for a week. Maybe instead, they should have been at the negotiating table. If this was such an important time, maybe they shouldn't have been at Billionaires Summer Camp. Because let me tell you, it's really hard for me to accept that the actors and the writers are the privileged elite when you're the one who's doing TV interviews from your billionaire's working vacation. The fact of the matter is that this strike is going to be long and it's going to be painful unless something radical changes. And there are going to be a lot of movies that are delayed, probably some movies that are canceled, and some projects that just don't happen. But in my opinion, it's because this is a battle that is being fought by a group of people whose future doesn't include a golden parachute. When I talk about writers and actors, and this is how the AMPTP wants you to think of them as well, people think of the elites. They think of the people they know, the people that are on podcasts and TV interviews, the A-list actors, you know, the showrunners like Vince Gilligan or people like James Gunn when it comes to writers. But that's not the average person that's in the Writers Guild or that's in SAG-AFTRA. It's the person who's out there every day hoping to one day be one of those elite. And this whole fight is really a fight to make sure that there is still a path, not for the people that are elite, but for the people that are starting out or for the people that want to be writers and actors in 5 or 10 years, to ensure that they still have the opportunity and the ability to achieve what writers and actors have been able to do for so many years. And for the first time in a long time, that's not something that you can take for granted. That's something that has to be fought for, and that's why the actors and the writers are on the picket lines right now. So this is going to wrap up our show for today. I, of course, will be tracking this story very closely, and I hope to bring you updates on this soon. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then.